Hello and welcome to the video analysis of the game Can Capablanca. This game will feature a double rook endgame, which is also the name of this chapter, and it's curious that in Capablanca's career double rook endgames featured more prominently when compared to other world champions. This is probably just a coincidence, but it's also a good opportunity for us to get acquainted with his manner of play in these not that frequent, but also not very easy to play endgames. However, before we reach that double rook endgame in this game, we start our analysis on move 9, where we already have an endgame, with the queens being exchanged on the previous move. And we find Capablanca here playing black already in an inferior position. So he, didn't play the opening too well, and now he finds himself actually at a considerable disadvantage because basically black doesn't have a compensation for white's pair of bishops. However, it is also important to note that the endgame is of a pretty flexible character, in a sense that both sides have a lot of options, a lot of ideas how to develop their pieces. And this is a type of situation where stronger players, thanks to their better intuition, manage to play better than weaker opponents. Because normally what happens is that weaker opponents, they tend to or try to calculate their way how they should play. Whereas the situation is so rich with various possibilities on every single move, making calculation impossible. And that is why better intuition tends to guide the player more confidently rather than any attempt at calculation. So what we will observe here is actually this difference in the approach. So we will see that white will be playing moves that appear normal, even natural, but without concrete idea. Whereas Capablanca would play concrete moves, and very soon we will see how white's vague play will actually give the game a negative trend for him. So without further ado, let's start our analysis. So in this position it's black to move, and he played the move bishop d7. The idea of the move is to cover the b5 square because the move knight b5 was a serious threat for white. And now white's next move is already indicative. He played the move bishop c4. And of course it's a fine move, developing move, natural move, covering the a2 pawn, maybe allowing for a long castle or the rook from a1 to move and so on. But when I say indicative, it's indicative of what I just described, which was playing moves that are normal but lacking concrete idea. So what is a move that was actually quite concrete in this position for white? Well, that is the move knight b5. So the move immediately hits the pawn on c7 and forces black to solve very concrete problems. So black can basically either take the knight or play knight a6, but neither option is very appealing. So, for example, in case of knight a6, defending the c7 pawn, after, let's say, long castle, black is actually in a very unpleasant position because he can never chase away the knight on b5 with c6 because the pawn on d6 is hanging. And capturing on b5, and that means if c6 is not played or bishop b5 is not played, the knight on a6 will remain on the rim forever, covering the pawn on c7. And instead of after knight b5, if black decides to take knight, let's say bishop b5, knight c6, now after some simple move like f3, white has a stable advantage of two bishops against two knights, and very, very simple play. He can put rooks in the center and then attempt to open up the game, maybe with f4, e5, and so on. So black doesn't really have active counterplay, and this would have significantly simplified White's task of finding concrete moves. So going back to the position after bishop d7, bishop c4 was what White played, but I just mentioned the quality of the move, yeah, which was to lacking in concrete idea. So knight e7 is Capablanca's choice here. What he does is he wants to develop the knight to g6. Yeah? Basically, he doesn't have much of a choice because developing the knight on f6 is simply ugly, allowing bishop f6, gf6. Like again, now White gave up the pair of bishops, but he obtained another stable advantage, which are these rather sad-looking doubled pawns. Whereas going back to the position after bishop c4, trying to chase away the bishop from g5 with something like h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and now knight f6. This allows White to play e5 and open up the game for the pair of bishops. So we see that he didn't really have much of a choice after bishop c4. So knight e7 is the only plausible way to develop the knight. So White continues with his normal play, short castle, but again, knight b5 was strong, transposing to what more or less to what we discussed, and I think more importantly, simplifying White's task of finding concrete moves. So knight g6, Black continues with the planned development. Well, again, not much of a choice for Black. And now another move, which is again decent, but one that I already marked as a dubious one, because first of all, knight b5 was still strong. So knight b5, bishop b5, bishop b5, let's say c6, bishop e2 with very simple play for White, just doubling on the d file. Okay, maybe rook d2, a3 probably at some point to stop the rook from attacking the a2 pawn, rook a d1 and piling up on the d file and attacking the pawn on d6. So first of all, knight b5, because dubious move a3, going back to move 12, dubious move because knight b5 was stronger, but also because again this leaves the position undefined and in the same with the same essence as I explained before. It is a position where many possibilities are available to both sides, and playing without a concrete idea, as White is actually doing with all his moves, gives the practical advantage of playing out the position to the stronger player. So from the weaker player's perspective, it was better to clarify and simplify the position, especially as this helped him stabilize his advantage. So this is this problem that players often face, whether they are stronger or weaker, in a position when there are too many possibilities on every move, makes them difficult to navigate. And again, the player with a better intuition, better feeling for the position normally has the advantage. And in this case, we will see that this was obviously Capablanca, because we can also observe the quality of both players' moves. So we saw White playing normal moves but lacking concrete idea, whereas Black was finishing development and playing moves that were, well, much more to the point. So Capablanca continues with short castle. He cannot really keep the king in the center, so short castle is necessary. And now rook ad1. Another normal looking move, putting the rook on the semi-open d file. But again, I mark it as a dubious move, and it's for the same reason of being rather vague, and also because probably it went unnoticed for White, but things are becoming concrete now. Yeah, so if up till now we had a situation where, well, both sides were developing, no contact between the armies, and things were not, in direct confrontation, the pieces. Now things are becoming concrete, and this move turns out to be an imprecision because of an important tactical detail that we will notice a bit later in the game. as the rook was in fact needed on a1 in order to support the a4 push. I will point out this moment later on. So with this all in mind, it was better to start with putting the other rook on the e file, for example, rook fe1, and to continue playing in this position. So rook ad1 and now knight c6. Well, naturally, black finishes development, and now white is faced with a choice. What is he supposed to do? And now this is also a nice positional puzzle for you. You can think a little bit here for white and decide what would you do here. Would you take the knight on c6? Would you move the knight from d4, or would you just leave it there playing another move? So this is a good puzzle to think about how best to continue from this position. So take some time and think what you would do. Well, what white did in this position was actually the worst choice of the three, and that was capturing on c6. Now, to explain first the importance of having that rook on a1 that I just mentioned. So ideally, white would like to play knight b5 here, hitting that pawn on c7, right? But here, as I mentioned, things are becoming concrete. Black has the move knight c5, attacking the bishop on c4. Yeah? Bishop retreats to e2, bishop e2. Now bishop takes b5, bishop takes b5, and rook a5. And now we see that both bishops on the fifth rank are quite vulnerable to attacks. Now, imagine white's rook being on a1 here. In this position, he could have played a4, and after c6, continue with b4. And when the rook retreats, rook a7, the bishop could have dropped back to e2, for example, and the rook on a1 would have defended that pawn on a4. But in this position, the rook is not on a1, so black simply collects the pawn. So now you see what I meant when I mentioned that rook ad1, after rook ad1 things become concrete, and this is the concrete reason why it was better to keep that rook on a1. And for example, in the position in this line, okay, if we go a little bit back, in the position after rook a5, if now white does not go a4, which obviously is not good because it drops a pawn, if he drops back bishop e2, then after knight f3, discovered attack on the bishop on g5, bishop takes f3, rook g5, black obviously has solved all his problems. Okay, no pair of bishops for white, comfortable position for black, very good knight, having access to f4, e5, dark squares, very a good position for black already, and he can be super happy after experiencing the problems earlier in the game. So coming back to the position after knight c6, yeah, and the positional puzzle, yeah, whether you take, move away, or leave it as it is. Well, it was better to move away, not to b5, but rather to e2, let's say knight e2, or even leaving the knight where it is with f3. Both moves would have kept advantage for white. But for some, well, I don't know, inexplicable reason, white decided to voluntarily improve black's position with knight takes c6, and after bc6, all of a sudden, black has no problems. So this is move 14, and we started our analysis on move 9. So it's just 5 moves. In just 5 moves, white, who after all was a strong player, Ilya Khan was a very strong player in the Soviet Union. He helped also Botvinnik later on in World Championship matches, so he was a strong player. But anyway, in only 5 moves, he managed to voluntarily, without being pressed, voluntarily worsen his position and improve black's position. So from a position with a stable advantage, he now arrives at a position where it's equal, where he has no advantage, and also in a position that, thanks to this pawn mass in the center, makes it easier to play with black. because with this pawn mass, black feels safe in the center, so he can use the semi-open a file, semi-open e file. He can jump with the knight in the center. All his pieces are comfortably placed. So this is like incredible that how players, myself included, okay, we tend to make life problematic to ourselves without being forced to do so. So we are digging our own graves basically, way too often, if you ask me, in our games. So again, this deterioration of voluntary, I always repeat voluntarily because white was not forced to make these inferior moves. So this voluntary deterioration of the position was a result of white lacking a clear idea of what he should be doing or what he should be striving for. Yeah? And this is a clear also indication of a difference in class between both players, because black was obviously clear on what he was trying to do, finishing development, get the king out of center, get the knight to c6 and so on, whereas white was free to develop as he wanted, but he chose suboptimal moves basically on each move. So here the position is now equal. Yeah. So let's see how the game continues from here. In this position, white played the move bishop d2. So he is preventing a possible rook a5, attacking the bishop on g5, but this was not really necessary. He could have continued with the rook fe1, simply centralizing the rook, and after rook a5, now bishop d2 can come with tempo, attacking the rook on a5, and in case of rook a4, attacking the bishop on c4, white can play bishop b3 instead of bishop d3 as he was forced to in the game, because in the game that pawn on e4 was not defended, that here the rook on a1 is defending that pawn on e4, so the bishop can remain on the a2 ga diagonal and chase away this rook from a4. But in the game after bc6, white continued with bishop d2, okay, and now rook a4. So Capablanca immediately takes advantage of the fact that the pawn on e4 is not defended, so he attacks the bishop on c4 and forces white to go to d3, the only square from where the bishop can defend the pawn. So bishop d3 and now knight e5. So natural play by black, centralizing the knight and making sure that he can, if he wants to, he can eliminate white's only advantage in this position, which is the pair of bishops. So at any moment, if forced, he can take on d3. And in fact, here white could have provoked that exchange. White could have played f4, and after knight takes d3, c takes d3, c5, would not have actually made his position much easier to play, because you see this curious square c7 of black pawn, c7, d6, c5, b6 are all on dark squares, and they very successfully limit the movements of white's dark squared bishop. And the fact that here we have a position with opposite colored bishops does not make it easier for white, because like I said, his bishop is limited in its movements, and black's light squared bishop can, for example, come to b5 and put pressure on this backward pawn on d3. So again, this we have this really consistent downward trend for white, and consistent upward trend for black. So he started from a pretty bad position in the beginning, and then the trend started going in his direction thanks to white's suboptimal moves. So it shifted from inferior position to an equal position, and now it's even becoming slightly more pleasant to play. So trends are tricky thing, especially in chess, and the difficult thing with trends is that once they start, it's not easy at all to stop them or revert them. They tend to continue. They have this really strong force of inertia. So it takes really conscious effort and the drastic action in the position to actually stop the trends or reverse them. So going back to the position after knight e5, white did not force this exchange on d3, so he continued with bishop c3. And now, possibly wanting to take on e5, and now Capablanca played the move f6. Plays f6 because what he plans, we will see later on, he fortifies the knight on e5 and gives himself the option of taking on e5 either way as he sees fit. So f3, White is already probably without any illusion that he has an advantage. He just wants to play solid f3, solidifying the pawn on e4. And now Capablanca plays rook e8. Now this is a interesting moment to note because he could have continued with something more concrete, yeah, c5 or taking on d3. Yeah? He could have forced the game further, but it's indicative that he didn't. Yeah. So strong players actually, as I explained, they have the better intuition, and it's in their favor to keep the position fluid, to keep the position full with options. Because, like I said, thanks to their intuition, they tend to make the correct choices more often than not, compared to their weaker opponents who tend to mess up. And up to this point, we have witnessed that actually happen. So what happens with rook e8, to my mind, is that Capablanca read his opponent. So he noticed that his opponent was making inferior choices along the way. So by keeping the position fluid, like I said, not taking on d3, not pushing c5, just keeping all the options open, he's hoping that his opponent continues to make inferior decisions. So he's giving his opponent more chances to go wrong and worsen his position voluntarily, as he was doing up to this point. So this is a common tactic that the stronger players employ against weaker opposition. So White plays rook f2, possibly intending to double on the d file or just dropping the bishop back to f1. And now Capablanca plays a fine move. He plays the move bishop c8. So by playing bishop c8, he ensures that White will not keep the pair of bishops, because if White just goes bishop f1 as he did in the game, Black can play bishop a6, exchanging the bishops and eliminating White's pair of bishops. And again, a situation where White has to make a choice, and he makes the inferior one. So from this moment, I get the impression that White just wanted to play strictly for a draw in a pretty dull, I would say, and primitive way. So what he does is he exchanges both light pieces and enters this double rook endgame, and hopes to make the draw just by standing still. And experience shows that you can't make a draw by standing still unless you have a fortress. And the position is far from being a fortress. And this means that at some point, White will have to do something active to achieve that desired result. But the problem here again is the trend and the inertia of the previous decisions. Yeah. So what we have is that if you play the whole game in one manner, passive, playing for a draw, static, standing still, and so on, it's nearly impossible in the moment when activity is needed to readjust in that exact moment and take that chance. It's infinitely more likely that the player will continue playing passive and standing still and so on, will miss that chance, and they will just be strangulated. And as you will see, this is what we will witness in this game. So what White played here was he exchanged on a6, but we should note a better way for White to solve his problems, if he had any, because he could have just played normally with rook d4. The idea is to exchange one pair of rooks, because with only one pair of rooks on the board, it's difficult for Black to pose the type of problems he managed in the game. So after rook d4, bishop d4, bishop f1, rook f1, White really has little to worry about, because like I said, with one pair of rooks, it's impossible for Black to create any serious threats, and whether that be with the light pieces on board or without. So white can also here happily exchange bishop for knight and enter rook endgame, where black will not have the same possibilities as in the game, because simply he will not have the firepower to create those threats that he did. But white did not do that, and after bishop a6 he primitively chopped that bishop. Bishop takes a6, rook takes a6, bishop takes e5, so eliminating the both light pieces. And again, here a small puzzle for you. How would you take on e5? Obviously not with the d pawn, to give you a small hint, because that just gives the open d file to white. But would you take with the f pawn or would you take with the rook? Okay, simple decision, but still one that needs to be made. So I'm pretty sure you came to the concrete decision, and that was taking with the f pawn. And now, why? Yeah, why is this the correct recapture? Well, it is the correct recapture because it gives black two very promising plans of how to move forward, how to improve his position. So these are both connected with the pawn breaks. One is the pawn break in the center with d5, and the second one is the minority attack on the king side by advancing h5, g5, and g4. Yeah. Of course, the king will be centralized on e6, and what black will do is he will try to maneuver using these threats of improving his position. So rook d3. Now we will see that white's strategy is just to sit still, bank on the impregnability of his position, and well, hope that he makes a draw like this. So b5. Capablanca first improves the position on the queen side. Yeah? So again, we can notice this manner of play that we explored in the chapter play on two weaknesses, so play on two sides of the board. So first he expands on the queen side. Yeah? b5, rook fd2, c5, expanding on the queen side, king f2, rook a4. So the rook is very well placed on a4 because it can support the b4 push. It has access to the strong d4 square, and also keeps an eye on the e4 pawn, making any possible activities for white based on f4 a bit more difficult to achieve. So a very good move that improves black's position. King e3, and now having achieved the maximum on the queen side for now, Capablanca centralizes the king. So king f7, rook d1, white is just marking time, king e6, king d2, and now rook b8. Now this is curious because the move b4, as we will see, is not really a threat, because b4 can be met by rook b3, and then there will be exchanges on b4. Yeah? So it's not a threat. But so it made sense, for example, to start immediately with the minority attack with g5 and so on. But Capablanca, in his manner, he keeps things flexible. He keeps things. He keeps white guessing. Yeah? And again, this is somewhat in line with what I spoke of earlier, which was to give white something to think about, to maneuver and pose threats that are not only real but sometimes even imaginary. Yeah, so putting the rook on b8, let his opponent spend some minutes to think about b4. Is that a threat? Is not a threat? Let him spend some time and energy to think about that possibility. So white plays rook c3, waiting, understanding that b4 is not really a threat because, like I mentioned, rook b3 can be played. He could have played something like h4. Yeah, so let's say here in this position, h4. But then black will prepare the minority attack with something like g6, let's say g6, h6, putting a rook somewhere, and eventually g5, which will lead to the opening of the h file, and something similar we will have in the game later on. So this doesn't really change the essence of the position that much. So rook c3, and now g5. So Capablanca starts the minority attack. And again, this is as I noted here in the comments, it's a curious both reversed and mirrored Carlsbad structure. Reversed because it's usually white and not black who is doing the minority attack, and mirrored because it's usually the queen side and not the king side like here where the minority attack happens. Of course, this doesn't change the essence of the goal of the minority attack, which is of course to push g4, attack that pawn on f3, at some point to take on f3, creating a weak pawn and backward pawn on the f3 square, and then attack it. Of course, the absence of many pieces and means that white should be able to deal with that only one weakness, but that's the only plan that, only, one of the two plans that black has in this position. The other one, of course, being advanced in the center with c6, d5, but he's keeping that that plan for later. So for now, he's concentrating on creating weakness on the king side. And again, you can notice the shifting of the flanks. Yeah, so he first advanced on the queen side, expanded there, reached the maximum, realizing that b4 is giving him nothing. So having reached the maximum on the queen side, he shifts play to the other side of the board and starts playing on the king side. So playing on both sides of the board and trying to create, of course, a weakness there. So h3, slowing down the advance, h5, threatening g4, everything normal. And now rook h1. This is a prophylactic move by white. He places the rook on the h file, and this temporarily stops the minority attack with g4, because then after h takes g4, h takes g4, the rook will already be on the open file and can start harassing black's king. So rook h1 and now rook d4. So Capablanca uses the fact that he's temporarily stopped on the king side to switch back again to the queen side and improve the position of his rook. So rook d4 check. White is forced to move the king because covering with the rook would be bad, as rook d3 is met by c4, attacking that rook on d3. Yeah, and after rook takes d4, e d4, black has massively improved his position, obtaining this very strong pawn pair on c4 and d4, and also the king obtaining access to the king side, king e5, king f4, king g3, so with a very, very promising position for black. Therefore, after rook d4 check, white is forced to move, king e2, and now, having improved a bit further on the queen side and in the center, if you will, black switches again to the idea of pushing g4. White plays rook d3 now, intending to exchange rooks, and now Capablanca avoids the exchange by moving the rook back to a4. The point here is that c4 in this position is not very good for him, because after rook e3, all of a sudden the rook on d4 is stranded, and c3 is a threat that is difficult to parry, so c4 would be a mistake here. So he goes back to a4. So you could argue that, okay, he didn't achieve much, you could argue, with giving that check, going back to a4, but this is the position is like this. There are no concrete gains in sight, and what black must do is maneuver. Okay, he improves a little bit, but okay, then he's forced to go back. Okay, he goes back. Okay, the game continues, and this is important to keep the game going. Yeah, and don't forget that black still has concrete ideas in mind. Like I said, g4 is one, and the other one is this expansion in the center with c6, d5 at some point. Yeah? So he has concrete ideas, but he's careful and trying to be as precise as possible as to when to execute these ideas. And now white plays a move that seems strange at first sight, because just a couple of moves earlier he played the move rook h1 to prevent g4, and now all of a sudden he removes the rook from the h file, allowing black to continue with g4. But this doesn't mean that, like I said, black is suffering because of not being able to push g4 when the rook is on h1. For example, if white played something else, let's say rook b3, okay, hitting that pawn on b5, black could have continued c6, and now switching the idea of waiting with g4 for the to play in the appropriate moment, and concentrate on advancing in the center with d5, maybe c4, and so on. So again, black is not devoid of constructive ideas. But white played rook hd1 and allowed g4, which is of course what Capablanca wanted to do. H takes g4, h takes g4, king e3, and now we can see the idea of white's move rook hd1. Again, he wants to defend in a sort of a fortress-like way. So he doubled on the d file, so in order to be able to play rook d2, when let's say black takes on g4, penetrates to g2, and then he can counter that invasion by rook 3d2, and then both rooks would control the first two ranks, and with no weakness, with weakness on f3 that can easily be defended by one or even two rooks, white hopes that he can keep the draw, like I said, in a fortress-like way. But the position is far, as I said, from being a fortress. And here, I think, so this is move 36, and I'm pretty convinced that the next moves were played in time trouble, because the next moves contain quite a bit of imprecisions by both sides. And playing in time trouble, it's far from easy to understand all the intricacies and details of the position and the possibilities that especially white has. When I say possibilities that white has, remember that when I spoke that of the trend and the manner of play that white applied ever since chopping off these light pieces and in transposing to the rook endgame. He was playing in a passive way. Yeah, he was playing in a rigid way, not doing anything active. And the position not being a fortress, I said that at some point he would be forced to do something active to secure the draw. But playing for too long in this manner makes it, like I said, practically impossible to mentally readjust and recognize the moment that he must strike now, go active in this exact moment, and achieve the draw. So even though these possibilities appear for white, the probability of him taking them was relatively low. So this was as a result of his mentality, if you will, when playing this endgame. And we will see what this meant in practice. So in this position, it was now let's speak both objectively and subjectively. Yeah. So in this position, objectively, it was best for black to take on f3, gf, gf, and now not go rook g2 like we said, because of rook 3d2 forces the rook back. So no rook g2, but rather to start to maneuver. So for example, get maybe the king to c6, king d7, king c6 to cover the b5 pawn, then maybe get the rook back to a8, maybe to f8 to attack the pawn on f3, maybe tie white down to the defense of the f3 pawn, then maybe move the king from c6, organize c6, d5, and so on and so on. So, and keep putting pressure on white's position. So this is the objectively what was best. But practically and subjectively, it was of course better to keep the tension as Capablanca did with rook h8. Yeah? So again, a lot of psychology here, banking on the fact that white will not be able to readjust and switch his manner of play. So why is this an imprecision, objectively speaking again? Well, it's imprecision because rook h8 gives white the option to take that pawn on g4. Yeah? But actually, no, not in this position. Sorry, no, not taking the pawn on g4, but actually he gave them the option to play f4. And this is what solves white's problems. Again, it's difficult to readjust and to how to say, understand this is the moment he needs to take and weaken voluntarily his position by weakening the pawn on e4 and so on, in order to make the draw. The point after f4 is that the threat is f5 to create the protected passed pawn. So black is forced to take. E takes f4, king takes f4, and after rook f8, king e3. White is becoming active because he has the idea of rook d5, rook g5, attacking the pawn on g4 and threatening checks from the side. And this activity ensures that he makes the draw. So this is the first moment when White could have changed the manner of play and achieved the draw by becoming active. But as I explained, psychologically it was very, very, very difficult, maybe even impossible for him. In fact, throughout the history of the game, there are very few players who were capable of instantaneously switching the mentality and taking the chances that appeared on the board, irrelevant of what was happening before. For example, Karpov was one of those players. So going back to the position after rook h8, again, psychologically not surprising that White continues in the same manner by just waiting. So he goes rook b3, attacking the pawn on b5. And now, again, Capablanca continues in the same manner, keeping the tension by playing rook h2. Again, objectively, he should have taken on f3 first, or played rook d4, attacking that rook on d1, rook b d3, and now rook h4. Okay, this is very, very difficult line. I'm showing it just because it has a pretty prophylactic idea, being that this putting of the rooks on the fourth rank with a lot of pawns in between is aimed against White's activation with f4, because here f4 can be met by the nice move g3, and all of a sudden the rooks are actually very efficient on the fourth rank, attacking both pawns on f4 and e4. So I have a pretty picturesque position, and okay, the reason why I'm showing this line. But okay, a difficult line, obviously. So after rook b3, Capablanca plays rook h2, attacking the pawn on g2. Rook d2, defending the pawn on g2, and still the rook on the pawn on b5 is hanging. But Capablanca improves the position of the second rook first with rook d4. Again, taking on f3 objectively was better, but again, I'm just pinpointing these, what's objective and what's practical. So rook d4, improving the position of the rook. Rook e2, removing and keeping the defense of the g2 pawn, and the pawn on b5 is still hanging. So finally c6, defending that pawn on b5. And now, again, crucial moment for White. Does he stay passive or he gets active? I explained, practically, it's impossible to become active. Yeah? Even more so, it was move 40, time trouble. So calculating the consequences of the correct move f takes g4, which again goes against all logic in this position and banks on activity, is difficult to evaluate. But the point of taking that pawn on g4 is that Black cannot easily regain the pawn. Yes, White wrecked his structure, e4, g4, g2, yeah? But he gained the pawn. So both pros and cons. And the line also, for example, there is a nice line that shows that Black cannot easily regain that pawn. So for example, rook h4, just to illustrate, attacking the pawn on g4, king f3, king f6. The idea is to go king g5 and rook g4. If Black is allowed to do this without any problems, he will be much better, of course, because White will have actually two weaknesses, g2 and e4. But Black cannot really do this, because after something like rook d3, useful move preventing some rook d5 activation, king g5, rook e1. The point is that Black cannot take the pawn on g4 because rook g4 is met by g3, and then all of a sudden this rook on g4 is left without squares. Yeah, so it's a small trick in the position, trapping the rook on g4. So therefore, going back to move 39, c6, you can understand why it was practically impossible for White to decide on this decision, decide to suddenly abandon the approach that he was following for the whole game and change everything and become active. Yeah. So bear this in mind when you play your games, if you can read your opponents and read the game in this way, when taking into consideration these trends and your opponent's manner of play. So if you're successful in reading your opponents in the game like this, you will also be successful in predicting their moves. So, not surprising, last move of the time control, Rook c3, keeping passive, keeping as it is. But Capablanca was also in time trouble, and he also makes a mistake on move 40. He plays the move g3, finally getting rid of the possibilities of f takes g4, but he misses a stronger move. He misses the winning idea, which he actually employed later in the game when given a second chance. And the winning idea was Rook h1. Because this is also prophylaxis against f takes g4, but a more subtle one. The point being that f takes g4 is now met by Rook f1. And the Rook cuts off the king from the f file, so there are no ideas like king f3 and g3 as we noted. And the immediate threat is to play Rook f4, attacking both the pawn on g4 and the pawn on e4. And this already is very problematic for white. But move 40, time trouble, nerves. Okay, so Rook c3, and Capablanca played the move g3. And now the game was adjourned. For those of you who don't know, maybe younger generation, for a very long time, the game of chess was played with adjournments. This was long before the computers came to the scene, and in Moscow, in 1936, when this game was played, the time control was the regular one that was used for a very long time. 2.5 hours for 40 moves. So after 5 hours, 2.5 hours each, the game was adjourned, and the players, of course, could analyze the game with on their own or with their helpers or whoever, and then the game would be resumed on a separate day dedicated to adjournments. So the game being adjourned, it was White's turn to seal the move. And by sealing a move, that means that White remains on the board, thinks for the move, writes it on a score sheet, puts the score sheet in an envelope, gives it to the arbiter, and then when resumption day comes, the arbiter opens the envelope, shows the sealed move to both opponents, and executes it on the board. So what this means that Khan was still sitting on the board after g3, and he was supposed to, after all this tension of the game, he was supposed to seal a move. And he sealed the move, and then the players went probably to dinner or elsewhere. It's funny that when probably they met somewhere, I'm not sure of how exactly it happened, but whether directly or via somebody, Capablanca actually offered a draw here to Khan in case he sealed the move f4. f4. And this was actually a rather it was not a correct behavior. Normally this immediately violates the secrecy of the sealed move. Immediately introduces some information: is it sealed, is it not sealed? So it's an unfair offer. Capablanca was right, actually. f4 does draw the game for White, but Khan, being an honest person, he said that he didn't seal the f4 move, so the game had to resume. So again, f4 is the move that it's the active move, a move that goes contrary to White's conduct in this game, how White's manner, how he played this game. And the point of the move is, of course, to activate White's pieces again. f4, the threat is of course, with either to push f5 or to take on e5, and also to liberate the f3 square for the king. So king f3, king g3 becomes a possibility. And after rook h4, which was the way to use this now slightly vulnerable position of white's pawns on the fourth rank, the point is that even though both these pawns will disappear, white will manage to capture the pawn on g3, which will result in a drawn rook endgame with 4 pawns each. So for example, f takes e5, rook h takes e4, king f3, king e5, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, and king g3. So we have 4 against 4. White has a passed g pawn, and this should ensure against any issues of holding the draw. So Capablanca was actually right. He was right that f4 draws, but likely he wanted to save some energy by accepting a draw in case without resumption in case Khan sealed it. But again, it was not a correct proposal. So going back to the move g3, again, Khan did not seal the move f4, missing the last chance to become active in this game and take that draw that he was so hard playing for. But he missed it. He played rook d3, and now, after analyzing the position, of course, Capablanca found the correct way, and we mentioned it, is the move rook h1. So black finally activates the rook on the h file to the maximum effect, putting it on the first rank, and the threat is to go and now start harassing the queen side, rook b1, for example. And this is already lost for white. So you see, passive defense rarely, very rarely, is successful. So again, white could have continued staying passive, but this was no longer feasible. For example, let's say rook dd2, rook b1, attacking the pawn on b2, c3, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, and now finally d5 advancing in the center. And the threat is to advance even further. d4 check, then maybe c4, and so on. And don't forget that white still has these g2 and b2 pawns that are weak. So combined with the advance in the center and attacking these pawns, black will win. So therefore, after move rook h1, white finally now decides to become active with f4, but this is one move too late. Well, and somebody wise said that chess is a tragedy of one tempo, of a single tempo. So f4, this worked on the previous move, but it doesn't work now because black has the very important move rook f1. We noted this idea in the previous comments. The point again is, as I mentioned, to cut off the king from the f file. So the idea of king f3, king g3 is no longer possible. And black also wants to put the rook on f4, attacking that pawn on e4. So white continued with f5 check. Taking on e5 would not have changed much. F takes e5, king takes e5. Now the threat is to take on e4. So king d2, defending the pawn on e4, but allowing c4. Now, because the rook is pinned basically on d3, white is forced to take, rook takes d4, king takes d4. And again, we can see this relentless elevation. White can barely move. And there are ideas to play maybe rook f2, depending on what happens with the winning pawn endgame. And also, of course, to keep advancing, maybe d5 and so on. So white is, and also, of course, the simplest maybe is just to go rook e4, win that pawn on e4. So after rook f1, white gave the check f5, and now king f6. So the threat of rook f4 still remains, attacking that pawn on e4, and it's even augmented with the idea of pushing d5 and expanding in the center. So Khan forces the exchange of one rook, c3, but now even a single rook endgame is winning for black, because after rook takes d3, king d3, d5, the central advance is devastating. So again, black is combining the threats of pushing c4, d4, and rook f4, attacking that pawn on e4. So b3, trying to at least exchange one pair of pawns after c4, but that doesn't bring much respite. So c4 check, b takes c4, b takes c4, king e3, and now rook a1. And now the pawns on a3 and c3 are falling. Black will lose the pawn on g3, but after capturing on a3 and c3, he will obtain two connected passed pawns on the c and d files. So king f3, rook a3. White cannot prevent the loss of the pawn on c3 because some, let's say, defending it with something like rook c2 can also loses the pawn after d4. King takes g3, rook takes c3 check, king h4, rook c1. Again, liberating the path for the c and d pawns. They can freely march forward, and also keeping in check White's idea of g4, g5. So the point is that after g4, threatening g5, Black has the rook h1 check, making sure that the king is pushed backwards, king g3, and now g5 is never a threat because the king on f6 controls that square. And meaning that White has no counterplay with g5, Black continues with d4. And now these two pawns simply promote by going forward. Rook a2, d3. The point is that if the rook leaves the second rank, then d2 happens and d1 on the next move, queening. So king g2, rook e1, attacking the pawn on e4. Now, can play king f2, but king f3 would not have changed anything because c3, and now these two pawns win against a solo rook, even without the help of Black's rook. So he played king f2, but rook e4 just picked up the pawn, king f3, and here basically without waiting for Capablanca's reply, White resigned because basically any move, rook d4, rook f4, even sacrificing that rook with c3 wins for Black. So very difficult endgame. The double rook endgame was especially instructive, but also the previous phase of the game gave us the setting for the double rook endgame, and I think the whole game from the beginning is quite instructive to see how stronger players can outplay weaker opponents even from inferior endgames. So you can see, I hope I managed to explain the scenario of the game, the story, if you will, of the game, how it developed, how it started from a position where White had an advantage, why White made certain choices, what was the difficulty in making these choices, why it was more difficult for White than for Black to navigate the position, and then also of course, after that, the change in the evaluation, why this evaluation changed, and then how the trend shifted in Black's favor, then he continued throughout the endgame. The missed chances by both sides, the difficulty, and why these chances were missed. So, well, again, a lot of instructive moments from this game. I hope you enjoyed learning them, even becoming aware of them, and hopefully you'll be able to recognize these moments and situations in your own games. So, thank you for watching this video analysis, and I'll see you in the next game. Hello, and welcome to the video analysis of the game Capablanca Janowski. We have a double rook endgame in front of us in this position, and here, if you look at the position, you will notice that its essence consists in the differences of the pawn structure. So White has the good central presence with the pawns on d3 and e4, and active rooks on the semi-open f file. This solidity in the center allows him to simply start attack on the king side with g4, g5, and attack that pawn on f6. So this makes it very simple and straightforward to play for White. And yet, even in such, you would say, simple, straightforward positions, we will notice some characteristics of Capablanca's style. So, he starts with g4, which is the natural move. Yeah, he wants to play h4, g5 or g5 immediately, attack that pawn on f6, create a weakness there, attack it, and make Black passive. b6. So, by playing b6, Black regains some control over the fifth rank by controlling the a5 and c5 squares that he plans to use for advance, maybe c5 or a5. And now it's a typical moment in the game. I'm pretty sure more than 90% of players, myself included, would just look at the queen side, say, bah, nothing is happening there, and continue simply with the plan of kingside advance by pushing h4 or playing g5 immediately. And this was perfectly fine. Objectively, this was a good decision. But in such situations when something natural was possible, but the player did not do it, such situations tell us a lot about their style and their manner of thinking and their preferences. So what Capablanca does here is play the move b4. So this is typical of him. He always wanted to prevent his opponent's play. So by pushing b4, he's limiting the advance on the queen side. So he's preventing c5 and b5, c5 and or a5 for the time being. So this is typical for Capablanca. I'm pretty sure by now you noticed it. He was always trying to prevent his opponent's play, even when that was not necessary, like in this case. So this is important. This tells us a lot about his manner of thinking, his thought processes, how he was approaching chess in general. So b4, stopping any possible advance. In a way, just one more note. In a way, this is in line with his understanding of what I described in the game Capablanca Rogozin as relentless elevation. He wanted to elevate, he wanted to push upwards on the whole board. So if possible, he wants to advance on the queen side, in the center, on the king side, everywhere, to push black everywhere backwards. So he's using now the opportunity to advance on the queen side. So black continues with king b7, and this is not just improving the position of the king, but also opens the 8th rank, and it allows for some ideas like rook a8, a5 with or without b5 first, then opening the a file for some counterplay. And in this position, Capablanca played the move king f2. Again, by now you should be you should recognize these situations that a simple king centralization based on general considerations is never that. So even though it looks like it's just a centralization, in fact Capablanca's king centralization is very concrete, and it happens in this very moment because he foresaw that in order to curtail possible black counterplay on the queen side, black can use the move rook d4 to attack that pawn on b4. And even though white can defend that rook with the rook b1, he will need the king to be able to come to e3 and harass that rook on d4. Yeah? So he's playing the move just in time, and there will be also a concrete line to illustrate the point. So the move is a prophylactic one against black's idea of playing rook d4 and attacking that pawn on b4. So king f2. Okay, to illustrate the point, yeah. So for example, a4. If white continues with a4 as he did in the game, after rook d4, rook b1, a5, we see that the rook is quite well placed on the 4th rank, and black obtains counterplay by attacking the pawns on the 4th rank. So the king is far away and cannot come to e3 to attack that active rook on d4. So going back to the position after king b7, king f2 is what Capablanca played, and black played b5. An alternative was to go for a5 without the help of b5. For example, rook a8, king e3, centralizing the king and controlling the d4 square, so rook d4 is no longer possible, and a5 now. So black wants to stir up some trouble on the queen side. a3, taking on a5 is not recommendable because black does not take, he plays b5, and after rook a5 white will have problems with the pawn on a2. So therefore after a5 a3, a takes b4, a takes b4, rook a4, rook b1, safely defending the pawn on b4, and white successfully curbed black's counterplay on the queen side. Everything is under control, and now he can go back to advancing on the king side and eventually in the center with d4 and so on. So coming back to the position after king f2, black decided to go for b5. So the idea is to push a5 with or without the help of king b6 and rook a8. That's That's his plan. So next move, again, typical of Capablanca, but unfortunately doesn't work. Yeah? But again, the point that doesn't work shows us this manner of play that he so often employed. And here we have an exception. Mostly that manner of play worked, but here it doesn't. Here we have an exception to this method that he normally employed. He played the move a4. And why is this so typical of him? Well, because as I explained, he wanted to play on the whole board, both sides. Remember, play on both wings. And also he wants to in an ideal scenario, he wants to completely kill off Black's counterplay on the queen side. Yeah? So he wants to address Black's play on the queen side by becoming active himself there. He wants to take over the initiative from Black on the side where Black is trying to be active. So this was another way to put Capablanca's manner of playing on both sides of the wing. So even when the opponent was active on one wing, he was trying to counter him there and wrestle the initiative from him and dominate on that side as well. So he wants to dominate on the whole board if possible. Objectively, it was better to go something like a3, keep the position as it is, or just continue with g5 on the king side. But he goes a4. So again, he wants to he attacks Black where Black wants to be active. But the problem with the move is that it fails tactically. Even though to show this, Black had to show some a bit unorthodox thinking, if you will. So the point here is that Black wants the queen side to become sort of a mess. Yeah, he wants the play to happen on the queen side, and he could have done that by wrecking his own structure by b takes a4. The point being that after rook a1, intending to capture on a4 when white will have total control, but Black is just in time to create counterplay with rook e5. So again, not an easy decision, and perhaps understandable that Janowski didn't go for it, because it requires some unorthodox both thinking and evaluation. But it turns out that in very concrete means Black obtains good counterplay. So for example, here white has a choice whether to take on e5 or take the pawn on a4. So let's check both. If rook takes e5, f takes e5, rook takes a4, there is the move rook d4. And now the rook is defended on d4. Yeah, so king e3 does not attack it, because after king e3 c5, Black uses the fact that the pawn on b4 is pinned and obtains active play in this pretty sharp rook endgame. Of course, the game continues, but objectively Black has good counter chances. So going back to the position after rook e5, the alternative for white is to take the pawn on a4, so rook takes a4, but now after rook takes f5, g takes f5, g6 is the important move for Black, undermining this strong pawn chain by white. And by attacking that pawn on f5, basically it forces white to take on g6, so f takes g6, h takes g6, but here Black can use actually the h file to create counterplay. Yeah? And again, even though his structure is wrecked on the queen side, he still obtains activity with that single one rook, and the king also can be used to maybe go to b5, maybe to push c5 or a5, depending on circumstances, and with enough activity for equality, objective equality. Yeah. But going back to the position after a4, Janowski misses this chance, and again, not an easy chance, admittedly, and he goes for the move rook d4. Yeah. And now a question for you. What do you think? Should white defend the pawn with rook b1, keeping the tension on the queen side, or should he take on b5 first and then play rook b1? So again, this is a simple question, simple exercise on the method of comparison. So basically you have two options which are similar. So you have to check whether the difference, actually if the difference works for white or for black. So difference being that tension on the queen side. So perhaps take a minute or two to try to understand the difference and who it favors. So if you decided to keep the tension, you would have followed in Capablanca's footsteps and you would have been wrong. So I find Capablanca's move Rook b1 both characteristic for him and uncharacteristic for him. Now, why characteristic? Characteristic because he liked to keep the tension. Yeah? He liked to keep the tension, and we've noticed this in more than one example. But uncharacteristic because he fails to see. He fails at prophylactic thinking. He fails to see black's idea. So first of all, let's see. The best move was actually to eliminate the tension. 8 takes b5, 8 takes b5, and only now to play rook b1, safely defending the pawn on b4, then continue with king e3, and everything is under control. Yeah, the rook will be chased away from d4, and white can turn his attention to advancing on the king side with g5 and so on. So this was correct. Now, why was this correct? Of course, the method of comparison or elimination, even if you will, but you have to eliminate one variation because it's obviously inferior to the other. So to understand that white should release the tension first is to see how black reacts to the move played by Capablanca, rook b1. And the solution here is the move that both players missed for some reason, and that is the move a5. And this, now you understand that the existence of the a pawn, yeah, or an a6, which would have disappeared after ab, makes black's counterplay along the fourth rank real. Yeah? And the point is that after a takes b5, rook takes b4, rook takes b4, a b4, black has here enough counterplay to keep the equality. So he's well advanced on the queen side. In case of bc6, king c6, he can use the rook, with, for example, with ideas like rook e5, rook c5 to attack the c2 pawn, or simply going to the a file, rook a2, and so on, with this b4 pawn being advanced and being quite dangerous, for example, if white loses the c2 pawn. So again, characteristic and uncharacteristic for Capablanca. Characteristic for keeping the tension, uncharacteristic for failure at prophylactic thinking. But luckily for him, Janowski also missed this, and he played the move rook e5. Yeah. Not a good move, because simply after king e3, solidifying the position, chasing the rook away from d4, white basically achieves a winning, technically already winning endgame. Strange, yeah? I mean, pretty sure Janowski saw king e3, and I don't know how he evaluated the position after that, whether he hoped that he could save the game, because again, when you're defending an inferior position and you see that you want to make a move like rook e5, but you see king e3, and now that's just crushing me on everywhere on the board, you desperately seek a chance not to allow it. Yeah? So you desperately seek something drastic not to allow this relentless elevation, yeah, that we will witness. So even that psychological situation for black, okay, I'm being crushed. If I allow king e3 and so on, I need to find something desperately here. That could have and should have drawn him in the direction of seeking desperate measures, and a5 should not have been too far away to see. But, okay, he missed it. And after king e3, rook d7, we have the move a5. And now this is Capablanca's dream coming true. The dream that started with that move b4 early on. So this is what he wanted to achieve. Black was becoming active on the queen side, but he wanted to crush him on the king side, on the queen side. He wanted to take over the initiative himself on the queen side. And this is what actually he did. He paralyzed him completely on the wing where black was hoping to become active. Yeah, this is ideal scenario. This is complete domination for white now, and the rest is actually a conversion of this huge positional advantage. So rook e6, dropping the rook back, keeping both rooks on board, but this doesn't help black much. So now that there is no need for the rook on b1 to defend the pawn on b4, rook bf1, again shifting of the flanks. He achieved the ideal on the queen side. Now he's switching back to the king side. So now the threat is to push g5. Rook d7. Black can only sit passively. He cannot do much. That's the position does not allow him to do anything active. And if we are honest, well, he missed his active possibilities early on. H6 doesn't change much because after h4, white inevitably pushes g5. Another option for black is rook ed6, desperately trying to re-establish a rook on d4, attacking that pawn on b4. But now we see how centralization is actually quite timely, because white is in time to go king d2, and after rook d4, king c3, safely defending the pawn on b4 and continuing with play on the king side with g5. So after rook bf1, black played the move rook d7. The idea of the move rook d7 is to put pressure on the e4 pawn by doubling the rooks, so that the central advance with d4 is not possible. So black is trying to restrain or slow down or ideally stop white's expansion in the center. But for now, what white does is actually he advances on the king side with g5. The center will come later. So g5 hitting the pawn on f6. F takes g5 is forced. Rook takes g5. And now rook h6, attacking the pawn on h3. And now again, simple question. How do you defend the pawn on h3? Obviously you need to use a rook. But which rook do you use? Do you use the rook on the g file, or do you use the rook on the f file? Well, a quick question. You just think for a few seconds and decide, but make sure you understand the reasons why you have decided for one or the other. So it's always important to understand the reasons why you decide on a move. You should always have it clear in your mind why you're playing a certain move. So Capablanca used the move on the g file, rook g3. Now the reason for this is that the rook on the f file is now free to roam. So the rook on g3 both defends the pawn on h3 and keeps an eye on the pawn on g7, and the rook on the f file is free to move. It's already active on the open f file, and it's free to move. So he's using one rook for two tasks, defense and attack, and he leaves the other rook free. So since the attack on h3 didn't bring much, now Janowski shifts back to the same idea of doubling on the e file and attacking the pawn on e4, stopping d4. He could have tried different things. For example, he could have tried rook e5, but this just is easily met either by the simple d4, forcing the rook back, or taking on g7, rook g7, rook h3, check, king d4, attacking that rook on e5, and then rook ff7 happens. So this just shows the activity that white can develop very quickly if black goes for something, picking up pawns or something more active. Alternatively, playing something like rook h5, trying to push c5, is met by d4. So since d4 is such a strong positional threat, Janowski plays rook h e6 and again, the idea, as I explained, is to put pressure on the pawn on e4, so d4 is not a possibility. So another question here for you, good moment to think. How do you continue here with white? How do you deal with this defense by black? Also notice, small hint, that apart from stopping the advance with d4, black also has the idea of putting rook on e5 when d4 is not possible because the pawn on e4 is hanging, in order to push c5. And if he manages to do that, he will obtain some counterplay. So how do you deal with this? How do you deal with black's plan of stopping d4 and intending rook e5 and c5? There is more than one way, so take some time perhaps to deciding. Yeah. Capablanca here found, as usual, a move that can both be played on general grounds and move that is at the same time prophylactic. He played the move h4. Yeah. So it's a move that slightly improves his position, going upwards, remember, elevation. But the point of the move is also prophylactic, because his idea is that now rook e5 can be made by rook g5. Yeah, made possible by this pawn on h4 defending that g5 square. So again, we see this typical move that happens as if it's played on just general grounds, but in fact has an underlying idea. This time it's this prophylactic idea of meeting rook e5 with rook g5. There were in fact, this was not the only solution to the problem. White could have played also rook f4 with the same prophylactic idea of meeting, slightly different actually prophylactic idea, but this being same that it stops rook e5, because now d4 is possible thanks to the rook on f4 defending the pawn on e4 in advance. So this was another good solution to Black's threat of rook e5. Yet I still find Capablanca's move slightly more precise, because he uses another piece to impact the game. So the rook on the f file is already active, so he uses the pawn to help his position, yeah, by allowing for rook g5. So since rook e5, rook g5 brings nothing, Janowski plays g6, and now rook g5. Okay? Controlling the fifth rank, controlling the c5 square, and elevating the position. So now if Black wants to get rid of that rook on the fifth rank, he needs to weaken his g6 pawn, and he does it by playing h6, getting the rook, moving the rook away from the fifth rank, and of course Capablanca puts it on g4. We saw the idea, yeah, prophylaxis again. Rook e5 is made by d4, so he's defending the pawn on e4 in advance, so that rook e5 can be made by d4. Of course, the pawn on g6 also hangs, yeah, so rook e5 is not really a threat, but by defending the pawn on e4, he wants to play d4 with or without a black rook being on e5. So Black defends the rook, the pawn on g6 in advance and prepares possibly g5. He just couldn't stop d4 anymore, so he switches the position of the rooks. And of course, White just advances with d4, and he wants to continue with d5, king e4, elevation. Yeah, king c8, and now another precise move. Immediately, rook f8 check. So it forces the king to go back, because going to the center, king d7 allows rook a8, and then the pawn on a6 falls. And now you see, and you will see also later in the game, how this maximalism, if you will, in Capablanca's approach to go before a5 to completely dominate White, to completely dominate Black on the queen side, pays off. Now that advanced pawn on a5 will turn out to be protected passed pawn if the pawn on a6 falls. Yeah. So again, these decisions tend to impact the game many moves later on. So after rook f8, it forces the king to go back to b7, and now e5. So again, Capablanca uses the moment to improve his position and worsen his opponent's position at the same time before advancing further. So g5, advancing, but this weakens the f5 square. And again, Capablanca is very precise, immediately taking advantage of his opponent's last move by playing king e4 and threatening king f5. So rook e7. So now king f5 does not really threaten anything, because it doesn't attack the rook, but by having both rooks on the 7th rank, this means that Black cannot defend the pawn on g5 anymore, and by doubling on the g file, so after h takes g5, h takes g5, rook f5, the pawn on g5 is lost. So apart from the huge positional advantage, now White will also have a material advantage. So king c8, now attempting to get the king to the center, but we will see he won't really succeed. So rook g takes g5, rook h7, rook h5, so stopping activation along the h file. And ideally, white would like to exchange one pair of rooks, because this kills off any even faint hopes for black to obtain some counterplay with both rooks, with possibly some checks. So probably Janowski was resigned by this point, because he allowed the exchange of one rooks, but keeping both rooks wasn't much better either, because rook hg7 allows rook f8 check, king d7, rook h8, and now apart from the idea of rook a8, white also has ideas to play against black's king with rook d8 check, rook h6, attacking the king when it comes to e6, so it's becoming even more difficult for black to parry all these threats. So after rook h5, he played king d7, allowing the exchange, rook takes h7, rook takes h7, but rook f8, reminding black why previously he decided to stay on b7. So now with the king on d7, the threat, the idea of rook a8, rook a6 is quite a real one. And again, as in the comment a few moves earlier, here as well we see Capablanca's plan justified of this before a5, getting that pawn to a5. So some desperate checks before the end, rook h4 check, king d3, rook h3, king d2, and of course if black continues to give checks like rook h2, king c3, rook h3, the king hides to b2, no more checks, and then white can pick up another pawn. Rook a8, rook a6. So instead of giving checks after king d2, black played c5, but this is just desperate. B takes c5, rook a3, d5, and okay, the pawns are simply marching, and in this position Janowski resigned. So again, not an easy endgame. We noticed a couple of imprecisions by both sides, but another impressive display once he had complete control over the position. Capablanca didn't allow any chances, but also the moments with these imprecisions, I also found them very characteristic of his manner of play. Yeah, so we are basically finding spots on the sun, but I think understanding these spots and actually pinpointing them helps us understand the strength that he actually had. So why these were actually exceptions to the normal ways when he was doing things, and the normal ways were normally working, and when they don't work, we understand these methods better. At least that's how it worked for me. By seeing when the method works and then seeing exceptions, you understand the method better. Well, like I said, that was how I found the learning process from Capablanca's games to be most effective for me. So again, another double rook endgame, very interesting and instructive one with several, I think, characteristic moments. I hope you found the explanations instructive, and hopefully you learned. I know I did learn a lot from studying these endgames, and I thank you for watching this video analysis, and I'll see you in the next game.